Recording in progress.
Okay.
What's up, everybody? Sorry, we got a little bit of a late start today. I'll try to speed through and make up the 5 minutes. How's everybody doing? Todd, did you start a sign business, or you're just decorating
I thought that was a nice backdrop, you know?
It is. It is.
It's a little over the top though. In certain meetings, I'm like, maybe I shouldn't use that.
Nice. All right. Well, I'm going to jump right in. As always, feel free to interrupt if you have questions, comments, concerns. I definitely love participation. So yeah, anybody have anything right away that they wanted to discuss or talk about or share? Can't believe you guys just want to listen to me yap for 30 minutes, but I always appreciate it. Even Shay has something to learn from me. I don't know what you're doing, but you're doing something weird there, Chris, with your background and everything. But all right. So who am I? I think most of you on here, I scrolled through, know who I am, but I started in real estate in 2004, have a team called Marsh Home Group here in Dublin, Ohio. I'm also a real estate investor. I own 15 units and a real estate coach with I Love Coaching. Follow me on social media. We are looking to expand our team actively. So if you're somebody who's interested in joining a team, definitely reach out. Would love to connect. We're going to talk about market trends today. Again, I think most of you have been on before. So a lot of the same, obviously, with new numbers and new information. So that's the nice thing. It changes regularly. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. Essentially, in a nutshell, what we're seeing with data compared to last year in particular is that we're seeing a lot of the same. Once we get into interest rates, we'll talk about the fact that actually the drop in rates kind of happened on the same week that it did last year. And now we're just kind of in a little bit of a holding pattern here for a few days, waiting for tomorrow, which is the next large economic news report that comes out that'll decide whether it's a trend or whether the lower rates were just a blip in the radar. So active listings, as you can see, we've kind of trended upward. If we look at last year, I'm going to grab kind of the laser pointer thing. Give me a second. Maybe they changed the buttons on me here. All right, maybe I'm not gonna, so I can't figure out how to get to the laser pointer. But we can see that the line in terms of active listings shot up sharply last year from what was historic lows in April all the way up to actually above where we were this year in July, and then kind of just rode out that trend line, maybe increasing a little bit month by month. Then this year you can see it was more of like a gradual climb as we just had much higher rates. And I would say overall, much more of like a linear kind of slowdown versus this abrupt slowdown that we saw last year. The next thing are pending sales. And again, this first section are all national numbers. So not going to apply, in a huge way to your local market. But I think overall nationally, we're kind of all trending in the same direction. The severity of the upside and downside definitely depends on where you are. And that's what creates an average, right? So found it. I was looking in the wrong spot. All right. So what we can see here with pending sales is they've come down since May, which again, really isn't abnormal. If we look at, like for instance, 2021, that started in June. If we look back to 2020, that was a weird year because of the pandemic. And it's weird. They took off all the pre-pandemic years, which I don't know that I really like. But 2020 was weird because we had the huge slowdown in the spring market due to the pandemic. So we're kind of on a normal, what I would consider a normal trajectory. I think the biggest reason for the lower number of pendings is just we have had fewer active properties. And so that's causing the pendings to be down a little bit off of last year. Newly listed homes is down. So again, kind of in the same trend. Now, what the interesting number, if we go back, so this was down, pending or newly listed was down 3.2, but pendings are down 7.6. So definitely a little bit more than last year, or a little bit. There's fewer there's fewer pendings than there are fewer new listings. It's kind of a weird thing to say. And so therefore that means we should see inventories rising, which we are. And again, that's not super normal this time of year, but we are seeing it. Days on market is 1 day lower than last year, but as you can see, once interest rates kind of trended up here at the end of the summer into early fall, we started to kind of catch up with that trend line that was created last year. Now, what will be interesting is if we do see the rates lower, are we going to see this trend line continue to go up in years past, or will we see the trend line level out more so? That'll remain to be seen. But I think a lot of the days on market conversation has more to do with seasonality than it does interest rates. And obviously, as you guys know, we have fewer sales that happen in November or in December, and then also going into January and February, just due to the slowdown during the holidays in terms of buyer activity. Median list price, we still remain near, or actually we can say record highs for this month, because the median list price nationally is exactly the same as it was last year in October, which is almost never happens. But you can see it's kind of been riding the same trend line. And as you can see in years past, we almost always see prices dropping as we go into the holidays. And then if you look here at the other side of the chart, usually starting in January, it's the low for the year. And then it just gradually goes up until that May or June timeframe, and then starts the slow trend down. You can see the trend down has been a little bit more pronounced the last couple of years. And that's, again, I think likely due to interest rates rising in the second half of the year, quite a bit more than they were in the first half of the year. But we're still sitting in a pretty good spot. Once we jump into the local market, you'll see locally, at least, we're up over 4% in terms of our average sales price year over year. Remember, this is our list price, so holds a little less water in my opinion. I'm not sure why Realtor.com doesn't produce a graph for the sold prices, but they don't for some reason. So price reductions are down 2.6% year over year, which is significant, just given the fact that that we're kind of above interest rate wise where we were last year, and we're still seeing fewer price reductions. And so either what I've seen personally, I've seen sellers kind of knew more so what the market was when they listed their property, and therefore have been a little bit less likely to negotiate, especially when it comes to the list price. It seems like what I'm seeing is that when sellers negotiate, it's usually off of a higher list price, which is kind of silly. Although we are still seeing quite a few price reductions, just not as many as last year. Regional stats, I've been loving this chart. I think if you're going to talk to a consumer, obviously my audience when I have these conversations are real estate agents, but I think when you talk to a consumer, obviously some of those slides can be helpful. But I think this section here is just super important to show kind of what was happening pre-pandemic, and to make sure that people understand the relative nature of things. So we kind of get in many ways, even in this conversation, kind of obsessed over the granular differences between the year over year. But I think this is one of the biggest things. Well, both of these boxes that are circled in red are just super, super interesting. So in spite of the fact that we came off like a 2020 and 2021 and first half of 2022 crazy real estate market, when you put into perspective that the median list price is up in the Midwest, for example, 31.2% compared to pre-pandemic, which was an average of 2017 to 2019. Like, that's crazy that the average person has over 30% more equity if they've owned their home. And even somebody that bought in 2019 or 2020 is looking at almost 30%. And the Midwest is the lowest, right? You've got in the West, even though they've seen the largest drop in pricing, they still are the highest increase in terms of pre-pandemic versus now. And so everything's very relative. But then still, this kind of shows you where we're at from a supply and demand perspective. That still, the lowest or the lowest drop in new listings is 15%, and that's in the South. But again, in the West, you've got a 32% decrease compared to pre-pandemic. So even though the amount of activity in the West has changed a lot, we're still in such a great spot when you compare just to 3 to 5 years ago. And that's really a big part of my conversation with my clients is like, look, the fundamentals just are not in place to have a huge housing recession right now. And on top of this, which we don't have a slide, but lending over the last few years has been more conservative than almost any other time, kind of coming into the post-pandemic or post-Great Recession age, where all those rules were put in place to keep lenders from giving risky loans. And so a lot of these people have high amounts of equity, and they have which means low debt to income ratio, but then they also had really high qualifying standards with those loans. So the chances of major foreclosures is just extremely low. Interest rates continue to be the news. Obviously, you can see that they have come off their recent highs. Mortgage News Daily average had them up above 8%, kind of at the beginning or kind of midway through October. You can see here, and we'll get into more detail, but the jobs report, which came out a week and a half ago, was way worse than expected in terms of fewer new jobs were created than expected. And you saw this drastic drop. The irony of that is when we go back and look at, you can kind of see right here, the little shade of blue, during the same week last year, we had a massive drop in interest rates as well. And then things kind of stayed level. And then we saw another massive drop in rates, and then kind of that trend down. We bounced around a little bit in that 6 to 6.5 range before kind of climbing back up. We've been on a little bit of a roller coaster this year up until about May, maybe end of April, where we kind of started that terrible trend upwards. So we've got a big consumer price index or inflation reading coming out tomorrow, which will probably decide whether this little slight upward trend that we've seen over the last couple of days continues or whether we see another drop. So we'll get into that in a second. New housing starts. Unfortunately, this report comes out next week. So we're always kind of feels like we're way behind because we're almost like over a month old on the data. But you can see over the summer, we had pretty good housing starts. And then in August, the number of housing starts dipped a lot. And that was when rates really started going up. And then the builders realized, oh, if we just actually provide really good rate incentives, buyers still want to buy new construction. And so we've continued to see the low inventory kind of spur the builders into continuing to build. And we'll also talk a little bit more about that. I had this slide in here last week or last month, And I really just use it to highlight the difference. And again, you guys can always put your emails in the chat if you want Allison to, actually, if you email me, Allison can put my email in the chat and she will respond with the slides. But what we saw, what we've continued to see, and I've seen it anecdotally in my own business, that the buyers definitely last year were obsessed with the interest rate increase from the low threes to the mid sixes. And yet this year, we've seen kind of that small increase happen from 6.5 to 7.5. And they seem to have been fine with that 6.5 rate. But then when things increased there in August, September, and October up to that 7.5 and over, that's when the buyers kind of said enough is enough with regards to rates. Then last week, when we jumped back down, we saw an increase in showing activity on our listings that were on the market, and actually some contract activity as well. But that wasn't necessarily true of the entire market, which we have some market data on that when we get into the local stuff. So these next couple slides, as you guys know who have been here before, are just really about how do we take all this data and turn it into something that, boil it down into layman's terms with our clients. So overall, inflation seems to be cooling, but definitely more slowly than expected. I have heard some rumblings of things, of people who are a lot smarter and know a lot more than me, saying that we could be going into a period of a lot of cool down, because the numbers that we track are kind of a lagging indicator to what's actually happening in the economy. I don't have it here in my slides, but I flew a week and a half ago, actually down to Charleston, and then I flew from Charleston to Chicago. And I don't even think during the pandemic was I on a flight that was that empty. We had over 100 empty seats on all 3 flights, because I had a connecting flight when I went into Charleston. And, even over the summer when I flew, actually, even in early October, late September, I was on a flight to Denver and it was almost full. And so definitely a huge decrease in travelers. So if you've been wanting to or needing to fly anywhere, I would highly recommend jumping on and booking some flights, because they're very, very cheap right now. But I like to say, like, the fullness or emptiness of my flights is kind of an indicator, or what discount Southwest is running kind of tells me what's going on with the economy and demand, consumer demand. Overall debt, we are seeing higher and higher credit card debt and debt in general, which is all not super out of the ordinary, but definitely something we want to keep an eye on. And just know, I think a lot of consumers were still living on their COVID budgets, even though they've added it back in a lot of additional spending that they had cut out during COVID, like trips and kids sports and some of that other stuff. And so we're seeing people trying to keep up with their current level of living. And even though they're not making enough money, and they never cut out the extra expenses they added during COVID. And so those things are going on the credit card. Employment, actually, I guess I didn't adjust this from last month, but it actually came in lower this month than it was last month. So like I said, 2 weeks ago, actually, I haven't said this yet, but 2 weeks ago, the Fed did decide to keep rates the same again. And they also kind of said that as long as mortgage rates stay as high as they've been, that they don't feel like it'll be as important to continue raising short-term rates. However, they have definitely not taken it off the table. Their goal is to get to 2% year over year inflation at all costs, including an increase in unemployment if that were to happen. I did already mention this a couple times, that employment came in well below estimates. And so it caused a pretty large drop in rates. Rates have kind of inched their way back up though throughout the week last week. And so that's putting all the pressure for mortgage rates on the number that's coming out tomorrow morning. And that is the consumer price index number. And I think it's really going to have a large impact on whether or not rates continue the downward trend, or they might even bump back up again more towards the record highs. I think if they go back up towards the record highs, we're probably going to see a really slow holiday season. And yet, if they go down, I think we could see a really busier than normal holiday season, kind of like what we saw last year, to be honest with you. So tomorrow will be a big day in terms of at least my opinion on what would happen. Will there be a recession? I would say that articles in general have been split about 50-50. However, since the jobs report came out, I've been seeing a lot more that are saying like that might be an indication that a recession is getting more and more likely. I mean, you've got people on either end of the spectrum that are saying no recession, and then some people that are saying it's going to be the worst one ever. But I feel like you always get that to a degree. I do think that I still believe that rates are going to stay higher longer. I think barring a major recession in the next 3 or 4 months, we're going to continue to see rates definitely in the sixes through next year. And we may even see, the lower sevens through the middle of next year. But a lot is just going to depend on whether or not employment stays high, or whether unemployment and whether employment goes lower, which in turn means more unemployment. In general, like I've been saying, if there's a recession, rates go lower faster. If there's no major recession, I think rates stay higher longer. And then you've always got the presidential race, which is getting more and more news coverage. And obviously after the first of the year, when the primaries start, I think we'll continue to see more and more of an emphasis put on the economy, which typically whichever party is in control of the White House and Congress, which right now that's split. So they try to do whatever they can to make things look as good or as bad, depending on who they want to win the race, as they can. But certainly the executive branch, the president, has the most ability to impact that stuff on the short time horizon. So I would anticipate that we will see more good things happening economically. And if there's anything that the president can do to impact interest rates, they will do it and try to make things look as good as possible heading into a re-election year. Builder incentives. That's one thing that we haven't really talked about here, but I think it was something that I wanted to make sure that we did talk about, because they are getting very aggressive with their incentives, largely around interest rates. And so I think that for any buyer that's out there that's saying they want to wait for rates to go lower, there are several builders. I think D.R. Horton and Pulte are the ones that are most aggressive in this. But certainly all of them are providing interest rate buy downs and money towards lower interest rates. So again, I've been talking about this for months, but it's so important as an agent to really understand financing and be able to explain that to the buyer. I was talking to my team about it this morning, and one of the things that you have to be careful of is right now, I think it was Pulte who's offering like $45,000 towards incentives, or you can buy down your rate. Towards upgrades, or you can buy down your rate. And what you have to be careful of is, when is the break even on the lower rate? Like if they had to take a market rate of, let's say 7%, and they're taking, let's say, a 5% interest rate, what's the difference in that payment given whatever their mortgage is? Let's say it's $500 a month. To get through $45,000, you're talking about 9 years, maybe eight to 9 years before you're even breaking even on the difference between that 7% and the 5%. And so how likely do you think that rates are going to stay at 7% for the next 8 years, and you're not going to be able to refinance and knock that down? but yet you're also still paying the height of the market price wise versus getting some of that money off the purchase price. So my encouragement to you guys is understand financing, understand the implications, and understand whether, and be in a position to explain to your buyers who likely don't understand any of it, why taking that attractive interest rate may not be the best move for them long term, especially if they plan on living in the house for not a long time.
Hey,
There are
Troy,
also, yeah, go ahead.
sorry to interrupt, but would they take money off the price, or is that not an option? You either got to do upgrades or interest.
Yeah, typically. And I mean, like with Pulte, for example, I mean, their average price has to be 600,000-700,000. I mean, it's hard to build a house with them and not have at least $40,000 in upgrades. Um, so I mean, obviously, if you're talking DR Horton, they have, they're much more of an out of the box builder, so it might be harder if you're at a lower price point to come up with that. But yeah, in general, the builders do not want to lower prices because that impacts appraisals. So if next month the rates go down and they're not in a position where they need to offer that large of an incentive and they've given you a reduction off the price, then now that's messed up their appraisal. But taking free upgrades does, in theory, result in a price reduction. But they try to keep those base prices as high as possible so they can justify to an appraiser why a property is selling for less or more. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's also another, like, I guess, trick or something for those of you that haven't been in the market for very long. It is possible, not often likely, but it is possible, especially on inventory homes, to negotiate with a builder. So those prices aren't like set in stone. And so if you ever do make an offer on a new build, especially if it's not completely done, if there are any changes or upgrades that the buyer wants, the builders are way more likely to give you free upgrades instead of a lower price versus the other way around. So you could probably, I would say it's like 15-1. Like they would rather give you $15,000 in free upgrades than give you $1,000 off the base price. Just because from future appraisals. Because remember too, especially if you're building from the ground up, that price isn't actually going to come to market for a year. And so it has a long-term impact if they sell stuff for way below market. And it really screws the people that are already in contract and haven't closed yet. So it's really just not a good PR move. It's way better to offer free upgrades. Also remember, lenders, I've seen over the last 6 months or so the biggest variation between interest rates from lenders that I've maybe ever seen in my career. Because rates are so high, you've got some small banks who are offering really unique products that are at sometimes significantly below market rates. And so just make sure that you're going out, and I don't think you should take every lunch and coffee with every lender that calls you. Otherwise, you're never going to sell any houses. But pay attention to your email, because these people are sending stuff out and they do offer some really unique offerings that sometimes could save your clients a lot of money. So just be on the lookout for those things. In general, I think I've hit on almost all of these, but in general, this is the big question that you need to ask every person that's thinking about waiting or thinking about buying. What's the likelihood that over the next 3 to 7 years, the average, which is the average time a person owns a home, that prices will go down in your area? If the answer is not likely, I would say go ahead and buy. I think the biggest danger right now are people that only plan on living in their house for 2 to 3 years. It costs on average 8 to 10% to sell a home. When you factor in real estate commissions, you factor in title fees and property taxes and all that fun stuff. And so, you really need to experience somewhere between 8 and 10% appreciation in order to break even and get all of your money back out of the property. So, if you're looking at a 2-year time horizon, that's somewhere between 4 and 5% appreciation. And that's a lot going into what could be a slow economic year in 2024. And so that's why I say, like, I like the 3-year number. I think if you're less than 3 years, you have to at least consider renting, if you don't already own, just because, or just consider staying where you're at if you do already own. Just because I think economically in the next 2 years, you got a lot of uncertainty. All right. Any questions before we jump into local market? I think I looked at everybody on here, and the majority of you guys are in the local market. But if I've got anybody from out of town that's jumped on here, anybody have any questions on national stuff? No? All right. Well, oh, go ahead. Who said something?
Sarah,
Hey.
do you know with the employment numbers, if they were factoring in all of the union strike, all the people that were striking, the auto workers? I was just curious.
Yeah. So the new job, that number that they look at are the new jobs added to the economy. And so no, that did not factor in. I don't believe it factored in the union jobs going back. But if it did, then that means the number was even worse.
Okay. Maybe I read that wrong. I thought it was I thought there was a slide that said something about the unemployment.
Yeah, so the number that came in low was the jobs added. They were expecting 180,000 new jobs added, and only 150 were added.
Okay. I think I just confused myself, but thank you.
Yeah. So this is
Troy.
Oh, go ahead.
Troy, Chris Shea. Quick question, just nationally, or quick statement on this. You mentioned, nationally, you're looking at indicators that maybe are the markets, that's lagging the economic indicators. So one thing I wanted to point out, I'm licensed in Florida too, and they're going into their buy season is coming up as we hit winter. But right now, what we've noticed is a lot of the seasonal rentals that typically are already sold out and not available for this coming winter are not being rented nearly as much this year, which means people are staying home. All just, again, leads to that economic, pinch. That what hurts first is people don't travel as much. They don't maybe go to Florida for the winter. They save on that. And I think it's just adding to that. There's probably is some still hardships to come if we're seeing that even in, other markets like that.
No, that's a great point. And like I said, I mean, I know it's silly and it's like first world problems, right? Which actually I love flying when the economy is down because it's way more comfortable. But yeah, I mean, I think whenever you start to see people kind of pulling back on the discretionary stuff, it's probably the first shoe to drop, and an indication of, what's, like you said, what's to come. And if you're seeing that on the short term or, medium term rental side of things with snowbirds and different things like that, you're exactly right. It's like how many of these things have to line up in order for it to start showing up in the numbers, which we've kind of been asking ourselves for a few months now. But I think it's really finally starting to show up in the numbers. Tomorrow will be a good test. Although, and I didn't want to go this deep in the weeds, but since you brought it up, I did see something that said there's some weird way they calculate healthcare costs and for some reason, October is like the inflection point. And so there's actually a chance that the CPI reading could be higher than it should be because of healthcare. And so I don't know. It'll be interesting. I'm definitely not feeling like super confident one way or the other on where the number is going to come in tomorrow. So it'll be interesting.
Oh, that's an indicator in October because of the open enrollment, I believe. But also, just a quick example in Florida, my neighborhood has typically this time of year would have 10 to 12 rentals available because they're all getting booked up. And the guy running them in there has 48 this year. So those are the kind of things I'm saying that, yeah, like instead of 10 to 12, it's about 4 times as many that have not been rented yet.
Wow. Yeah, that's significant. I was thinking like maybe twice as many, but 4 times, that's a lot. Are you seeing anything else? What about, I mean, now that this is like kind of the beginning of the busy season down there, is the activity way down, or is that still like a little too early to gauge?
It's too early to gauge because what happens is the snowbirds go down and then they kick tires and they're buying. 80% in Southwest Florida are cash deals, so rates haven't hurt them. I think what hurts them is not necessarily the rates, but less cash or economy worries. So they get, they pull back on that. But the purchases are still there, but we're seeing prices come down. They have started seeing that, but that could be mainly their seasonal stuff that was selling 600 to 650 is like mid 50s, but they had an even bigger run up than us. We had a 70% gain in one zip code that I sell in 1 year, 21 to 22. So some of that adjustment needed to happen. I don't think it's unhealthy, but I definitely think as I get into Christmas and New Year, if we don't have stuff getting rented, that'll be a huge economic indicator.
Well, yeah, and then obviously that puts pressure on people to list their properties, right? Like not everybody owns them in cash and has the ability to carry a mortgage on a vacant property for 8 months.
100% correct, because a lot of them that did buy them, even if they used cash, they make income off of them. When they're not getting them rented, they still have to pay the high HOAs and all the carrying costs. And in Florida, taxes and insurance are going through the roof. So there's going to be pressure there to sell for other indicators. But I still think, yeah, it's probably more a case of there will be some deals even down there because of people that were relying on that income not getting it.
Yeah, I many of you guys know I have a lake house at Norris Lake in Tennessee, and just what I've seen there, and I think Florida, not everywhere in Florida, but definitely large parts of Florida are just so dependent on travel and tourism. And I think my opinion is I think if any part of the real estate market is going to see a downturn and a recession, it's going to be that second home market, because there were so many people during COVID that used that extra income and cash that they had that they weren't spending to buy second homes. And that happened to coincide with the Airbnb boom. And so everybody thought that they could be independently wealthy having an Airbnb. And I think that those prices got artificially inflated. And so I think definitely the largest risk, but that's something also where obviously Columbus does not have a huge, market for that type of housing. So it's just another reason why the Columbus market, I think, will stay above the fray with a lot of that stuff and probably be one of the better markets nationally. All right, so this is local market. We're obviously seeing the difference between actives and solds. The gap is continuing to stretch. So we saw that a little bit last year here. And then it started widening going into December and January. And then we saw the impact of the rates dropping during this time start to show up in the February data. And then March, we were back to more solds than actives. And then now here in September and October, we've flipped back again to having way more actives than solds. So it'll absolutely be interesting to see kind of what happens as we move into the fall, and I think, or into the winter. And I think so much of that is gonna be impacted by interest rates. If we look at just numbers here, and especially October compared October 2023 versus last year, we see the number for sale for resale was down just 1%. The new listings were down 2%. And then the solds were down 10%, which again is just part of the fact that new listings had been down so much more than 2% all year long. And so I think this is just an indication showing kind of the result of that. With new construction, it's the opposite, right? The builders are taking advantage of the low inventory. So the number of new listings, at least listed in the MLS, was up almost 9%. The number for sale up 11%. And obviously the number sold up 20%. Now you can see that obviously the differences weren't enough to offset our differences in the resale market, but it does help. And if you have buyers out there that haven't been able to find something and you haven't introduced new construction, I would definitely do that. And then this is today's stats. So this is just comparing November to November across the entire market. So you can see that we're actually up in terms of the number of active properties, up 12%. And interestingly, we're up 10% on overall new listings. So we'll see if that's a trend or if that's just kind of a blip in the radar. That'll be an interesting trend to watch. But in general, if we look over here at the solds compared to the new listings, we've essentially been, for the most part, selling everything that comes on the market. And so we're down almost 15% on new listings, and we're down 16% on sold. So that correlation is pretty strong. Days on market still inching upward. Again, we're actually inching upward right about the same pace as last year. And so it'll be interesting again to see if that trend continues. And then over here, we've got the average sales price compared to the original list price. So this also factors in price reductions down to 97%. So again, last year we got into that 96, 97%. And we seem to be headed in that direction now. And I would guess, given the fact that the stuff that's in contract now won't close until the end of this month or into next month, we'll probably see that same dip happen in December again, down to 96. Months of supply in the resale market up to 1.3, which is actually the highest it's been in the last couple of years, about twice as high as it was just 6 months ago. But remember, a balanced market is still 4 to 6 months of inventory. So I think we see interest rates flip and we see that market, this number drop pretty quickly as buyers re-enter the market. New construction has been hovering between that 2 and 3 month number for the most part over the last year. So really not much of a change there. Here are the sold numbers. So we see the average sales price is up around let me take that back. We see the average sold price in October is up 4.1%. The average active price is up 17.6% compared to last year. And like we talked about last month, it's very normal to see a price peak sometime in the summer and then see that slow decline. We saw it last year. Actually, last year we saw a faster decline and kind of a major one due to the massive slowdown we saw in the fall last year. I think that we'll avoid that big of a price drop, would be my prediction this year. It just has been a lot more level. But I guess, we'll see as the numbers roll in. So this was something that Allison did a great job creating for me. I expected it based on our anecdotal data, honestly, in terms of the listings that we have. We saw a really big spike last week in activity along with the drop in interest rates. But we actually market wide actually saw a decline in showings last week with the drop in rates. So not sure what created that drop in showings other than just the seasonality. You can see the seasonal drop here through the month of October, which we would kind of anticipate. But for whatever reason, we saw a jump in showings the week before or the week of the rate drop, I guess. So maybe last weekend for everyone except for our listings showed a higher bump than this most previous weekend. But either way, I thought this was an interesting chart, and I think we're going to continue to track this each month so we can just kind of see that correlation between the local market and interest rates. And then last but certainly not least, rents. For some reason, realtor.com did not update, so this is still September, but October year over year rents for a one-bedroom are up 4.4% in Columbus, according to Zumper. Year over year rents for a 2-bedroom are up 6.9%, but you can see month over month they're like either level or a little negative. But overall, with regards to rents, I still think most neighborhoods in the suburban areas, you can rent for less than your mortgage payment is going to be, even if you put down 20%. And so it'll be really interesting to see if rates stay high, specifically with the millennial generation, which is the biggest generation of buyers out there right now. And there's still a lot of them that don't own homes. It'll be interesting to see if they continue to buy or if they pull back and kind of move back into more of a rental space. So would love to answer any questions here in the last couple minutes. Does anybody have anything else? No? All right. Well, if nobody has anything, thank you guys for coming. And we will see you next month.
Thank you, Troy.
Thanks, Troy.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you.